Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise About Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise About Justice Movement and the Rise About Justice Movement, the podcast. All right, so another addition to our candidate series, and this one is out of New York. Robin, you are running for Congress in New York District 25. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This is going to be a good one because everything on your platform aligns with my values, and I'm not even in New York. I am based in this beautiful state of Kansas. We have a lot of issues that go on here that, you know, maybe the current leadership isn't necessarily listening to, right?
Right.
And we see that bipartisanly,
Yeah.
both parties are not meeting the current moment of what the constituents need. And
Right.
we'll dive into this a little bit, but a lot of that is with money in politics. And we'll get into that here in just a minute. Your incumbent is no stranger to that issue specifically. But first things first, I would love for you to walk our listeners through, who you are, what your background is, and why it's important for you and other progressives across the country to run for office at this particular moment.
Well, again, thank you for that introduction. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Our current leadership is not meeting this moment in history, right? We have threats to our democracy that have been exacerbated by the current administration. And I think people are genuinely looking toward their representatives to protect them from some of the um, awful policies that the executive branch has been imposing on our constituents. So I am a first generation American. I am the daughter of immigrants. I'm a 14th Amendment American. And so I am appalled by the attacks on immigrants in this country. I'm appalled at the ongoing attacks on all of us. And I think now, at a time when our basic freedoms are under attack and the people who are charged with protecting us from this lawless administration continually fail us, now is the time that we need leadership that is going to meet this moment in history. So that's why I'm running. I served as a town board member in a suburban community in upstate New York for 8 years, and I was able to implement a progressive agenda that meets the needs of the people here in my community, and I would like to expand that to the constituents of New York 25. I think it's time that we have people championing those affordability policies that are going to increase our ability not just to live, but to thrive in our communities. For too long, we've had leadership in this country that is goes along with the military industrial complex, goes along with mass incarceration, goes along with not providing health care to all of our constituents, not providing educational opportunities across the board so that our our educational outcomes are not tied to the zip code in which we are raised. And I think people are finally starting to realize that we need people who in office who are aligned with people's everyday interests as opposed to the interests of corporations.
Which leads me into my next talking point. Money in politics is literally riddled in literally every election, right? And it doesn't matter like how big the election is. Like obviously you're running for Congress, but money in politics affects the local mayor's race, right?
Absolutely.
And it trickles down from the
Yeah.
top down. Gee, it's like trickle down doesn't work, right?
Right.
Um, but speaking of which, we see the rising cost of literally everything.
Yeah.
So housing, the rent is too damn high.
Too big.
Groceries, it's too damn high.
Yeah.
Healthcare doesn't exist in some places.
Yeah.
Utility bills and other expenses that our wages are not matching.
No.
The last time that the federal minimum wage was raised was, I believe, in 2005,
Right.
like around that area, 2005 to 2010, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
that didn't take into effect about the rising cost of healthcare, the rising cost of medications, the rising cost of literally everything. And I'm thinking about, that single parent that's working 2 to 3 jobs just to put food on the table for her children. Okay. I'm thinking about that.
Yeah,
Working at a local bar or working at a local, AOC started was a bartender,
right,
right?
right,
And she's still a part of that working class. She has that
right.
background. She understands, right? We
Yes,
need more people that understand how to lower these costs and expand the opportunities. And everything that I'll be asking you is directly off your platform. And I would love to, start out with talking about lowering the costs and expand opportunities. What does that look like to regular people? Okay. People like me, people like you, people like your community.
right.
And you have on your website about Monroe County, 23,000 plus residents uninsured. That ain't right. That is beyond fucked up to say, the lack of term, right?
Right. Right.
Median rent in Rochester up 25% since 2020.
Yeah.
40% of Rochester children live in poverty. Living wage 20 an hour needed for one adult and one child in Monroe County. Who's
Yeah.
the who are these high costs benefiting? It's benefiting that wealthy and the top 1%, but
Absolutely.
it still trickles down. So walk me through this part of your platform and what it would look like to lower those costs for where people can afford to live.
Well, I think the key is making sure that people have a living wage, not just a minimum wage, but a living wage, so that people are not stuck in 2 or 3 dead-end jobs trying to make ends meet. And I, it is unconscionable to me that we have these corporations that we are subsidizing that then turn around and seemingly can't afford to give their employees a living wage. So, why are we awarding these corporations with all of these subsidies and low tax rates, lower tax rates than a lot of their employees have? And then so they can turn around and not give their employees a living wage. That makes zero sense to me. So, again, I think we need to make sure that our tax code reflects our values. I think a lot of people are unaware that we have a tax cap, a salary tax cap on Social Security. Once you reach $168,000 in earnings, you stop paying Social Security tax. And I think the cap is cynically set there so that people do not realize that it exists because only 6% of earners across this country actually out earn that $168,000 tax cap on Social Security taxes. So I think that most people do not even realize that we could expand the social safety net dramatically just by raising that tax cap, just by making sure that people are paying their fair share when they are in that top 5 or 6% of income earners in this country. I think that they can afford to pay their fair share, and the amount of social uplift that we could achieve by raising that tax out. What if we doubled it? Or, just if we were looking at, $320,000. Again, we are only impacting a very small set of earners in this country. But the amount of social good it would do, the fact that we could stabilize Social Security for everyone and make sure that it's guaranteed for future generations, that would be life changing for people, I think.
Speaking of life changing, what, as a part of your platform, investing in public health and build safer communities,
Yeah.
New York in your district is no stranger whenever it comes to gun violence. And I really love that you have this on your platform because some candidates miss this mark. Okay. And a lot of that is because of money in politics. Right.
Yes.
And this is on both sides of the aisle. This is not just one or the other. This isn't red versus blue or left versus right.
Right.
This is literally a public health epidemic, and it is a
Absolutely.
public health crisis, a public health emergency.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
love. I'm gonna read this directly off your website because this literally sums it up directly perfectly. Okay,
Mhm.
safety is a public health emergency. Every person deserves to feel safe in our community. We need care, not criminalization. We deserve safety that promotes health and well-being for everyone. We must build systems of care and compassion. I will continue pushing to transform public safety in the war on drugs, address the gun violence epidemic, and protect survivors of violence. First of all, thank you. Thank you for recognizing survivors in
Well,
your advocacy work because it is incredibly crucial to have survivors at the table and also helping with the like I can't even explain how important this is because I'm a survivor of gun violence myself,
mhm.
which is where the radical justice movement comes from, is
Mhm.
recognizing that we have a lot of systemic failures in this country. And I say systemic because these systems were not set up to help people like me.
No.
They were not set up to help people like our black and brown neighbors. They were not set up to help people like my mom, who is a disabled woman. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah.
And Rochester had 58 homicides in 2023, 47 in 2024. Monroe County saw 512 overdose deaths
Mhm.
in 2023, down to 292 in 2024. So there, that's over a little less than half.
Right.
However, one is too damn many.
Yes.
One
One.
in five adults experience mental illness, and
Mhm.
most go untreated, especially in those rural communities.
Right.
So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So what would you support as far as addressing violence as a public health emergency?
Mhm.
And what would you propose as far as ending gun violence?
That is a great question. And thank you so much for highlighting that part of the platform because I think when we talk about community safety, we tend to talk about it in terms of police. And it extends so far beyond, enforcement, law enforcement. In order to achieve community safety, we need to build systems of community care. So I often talk about, when I talk about, for instance, over policing in our communities. Used to say, my suburban community is does not suffer from over policing because the police are accountable to the community that they serve. And one of the reasons is that we have a ratio of police to citizens, and it's about 1 in 1,000, right? We've got a, a population of 37,000 people in my town, and we have about 40 sworn officers. You go over the border to the city of Rochester, and they have 3 times as many police as per capita as my town. And that creates a system of occupation as opposed to a system that is community policing. And we need, instead of investing so much in a system that arrives after the fact, right? Arrives in the wake of violence occurring, why don't we invest on the front end, right? Making sure that people have what they need so that we don't have that proximate violence occurring, right? Making sure that we are addressing the epidemic of the opioid crisis, making sure that we are addressing after school care, giving our youth someplace safe to be after school hours, and so that they won't get involved in some of these less savory things. We can provide those systems of community care, and we do provide it in some communities, right? The way that it looks in the city of Rochester as opposed to the way it looks in my community of Brighton, There's a stark contrast. And we need to do something to address that disparate um, uh, dissemination of resources, right? We need to make sure that in every community, we are building recreational systems, making sure that educational outcomes are equitably based. We need to make sure that when we have people who are suffering from substance use disorder, that those systems of care are there. And we can do it if we kind of make sure that we're investing in those systems of care as opposed to those systems of enforcement only. I mean, we see the same thing with our immigration system, quite frankly, right? We have invested billions upon billions in ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. But how much have we invested in making sure that people uh, don't spend years waiting for our court system to work through their asylum and refugee and immigration cases, right? So, if we invest on the one end, we will have better outcomes in terms of proximate violence on the other end.
In your area alone, so New York's 25th congressional district, the
Yeah,
population in 2024 was estimated to be 768,525. Okay.
yeah. Mhm.
So whenever we think about the current makeup of the House of Representatives in Congress, there is a cap of 435. One representative represents 700 plus thousand,
Yeah,
constituents. I lost my
yeah.
train of thought there for a second, Robin.
No worries, no worries.
um, what are your thoughts as far as uncapping the House?
Oh my
Because
goodness. I am
one,
so glad you asked about this.
hold on.
Yeah,
I,
go
I, I
ahead.
know, I know you got a lot to say. Hold on.
Yeah.
One of the things that a fellow Kansan is doing, his name is Mr. Beat. Okay, he's really big on like YouTube, and he does like all kinds of different things. But he's an educator. He's a teacher,
Yeah.
and he's a badass human being. But he's endorsing candidates that are supporting uncapping the House. Now, I understand that there's a lot of work to do before we get to that specific point, but it is good to get it talked about because one representative should not represent 768,000 people. Now, I don't know about you, but my phone, goes off with text messages. My email goes off the rockers, social media. Can you imagine? And, if, should you be elected to this office, which I have a sneaky suspicion, it very well can happen because I think people are ready for change.
They
I
are.
think people are exhausted of the current systems because it's obvious they're not working. It's very, very obvious. Or you wouldn't be running, right? Because everything would be good, right? And we wouldn't have to worry about this in 2026. This is literally all just common sense. But I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about uncapping the House to where it represents the people because we love democracy. We
I love.
love the sound of democracy. Have we ever been there? We've had moments. Do I believe that we were in a full democracy? No, I do not, because injustices still run deep in our
Yeah.
communities. But
Mm.
just let me know what your thoughts are about this and how do we get there?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the basic tenets that is enshrined in our democratic system is the concept of one person, one vote, right? And so when we have these huge disparities in the size of our congressional districts, we inherently have a unjust system, right? We have some congressional districts that have a little more than 510,000 people. And then my congressional district that has, almost 800,000 people, 775,000 people. And, if we look at the current trends, by 2030, not too far in this distant future, we will have, again, some congressional districts that have 850,000 people and others again that have, about 550,000 people. And that subverts the concept of fairness. Now, we have not raised the cap on the number of representatives in the House since 2029, or I'm sorry, 1929. And and we just stopped doing it arbitrarily. And for many decades, we it would be one of the duties of Congress, right? Oh, it's time to raise the cap on the House to keep up with the demographic population. So let's raise the cap. Now we never talk about it, and I think we don't talk about it because it benefits certain people, right? This concept of you know people versus representing land, right? We have, it's already a system where, we have two senators for every state, and regardless of the population of a state, you get those two representatives. So we don't have that concept of fairness with the Senate, but definitely with the House of Representatives, that wasn't intended. It was always intended that we would, you know, periodically raise that cap on House membership. And I think that you can see it was intended because it's actually not that difficult to raise it. You can raise it with, you don't need like a super majority in the Senate or anything like that. You can raise it with a majority of House votes. So the fact that they don't bring it up tells me that somebody is benefiting from this system of injustice.
Oh, absolutely. We know who that is. We know exactly who that is because in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled on Citizens United versus the FEC.
Yeah.
And this opened the door to a number of different issues, which has led us further into capitalism, first of all,
Hmm.
and this trickle down economic system that clearly does not work because we have politicians that are, and your incumbent is no different in this. Um, we have politicians that run on these platforms. It sounds like a true populist platform. And I say populist because, it expands and it goes very far, right? But what are your thoughts about Citizens United, first of all? Because anybody who's listening, if you're older than 2010, you were older than Citizens United. Just like if you're older than 2003, you're older than ICE and DHS, which was created out of alleged fear, right? And I say alleged because it's a legend.
Yeah.
um, but thinking about everything that's kind of like going on right now, it leads to money in politics. There's a lot
Right.
of influences. We see the APAC influence. We see J Street. We see like all of these, the pro-Israeli lobby. We have the fossil fuels. We have, oligarchy. We have the tech bros. There's a lot that kind of like goes into this. So what is your thoughts on reversing Citizens United and how do we get there? Because we have a 6-3 majority on the
Yeah.
Supreme Court. Thinking about the current makeup of that, we obviously need a judicial ethics for the Supreme Court. That is literally obvious, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
thinking about getting money out of politics, how do we get there and what would it look like as far as to what you would argue and fight for in Congress?
Right. And I think, interestingly enough, some states are kind of showing us the way by
Mhm.
changing their rules with regard to political contributions. Now, let me be clear. Money does not equal free speech. Okay.
Period.
That was an errant ruling. It is inconsistent with case law. Again, I think people stood to benefit from enshrining like money as speech, and that's why it exists today. But there are some states who are looking at, I think public finance is one of the ways that public financing of campaigns is one of the ways that we can remove that toxic influence of money in politics. But definitely, we see that it does affect the way representatives vote, right? My opponent, for instance, accepts hundreds of thousands of dollars from APAC, so he votes with the Israel lobby, right? He is very quiet when it comes to, everything from the war in Iran to, trying to uh, stop the flow of weapons to Israel and funding those weapons by the U.S. And same thing with the insurance lobby, which is another one of his big donors. He will never support Medicare for all because he has money coming from insurance interests that are opposed to Medicare for all. He gets money from some of the energy companies like Rochester Gas and Electric, which has been just raking our constituents over the coals in terms of rising energy costs and 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 decreasing affordability in our communities. So you can always trace people's votes back to the money. And I think it is imperative in order to save our democracy that we undo Citizens United. Congressional, um, there are some bills before Congress right now that would, propose legislative fixes, but definitely some states are doing some very interesting things to kind of take back their control of their electoral systems, and it might have to start in the states, but definitely on the federal level we need to be working on this problem as well.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned about in the States because that's where a lot of change can happen. And it gives that little bit of a glimpse of hope, right? And speaking of which, we saw very grassroots and progressive victories
Yeah,
last year,
yeah, yeah.
including one in New York. That was very
Over
exciting.
in New York, it was very
What were your thoughts as far as like how he was running his campaign? And, it's obvious that that style of campaigning is going to work for the working class. It's very obvious, right? And it gives that glimpse of hope, but it goes beyond just Zoran, okay? Because there was also a massive win in Seattle. Democratic Socialists won in Seattle. And then also on the Atlanta City Council, Kelsey Bond also won, making history as the very first Democratic Socialist. Sorry, my brain is going in 40,000 directions. I got a lot that I want to talk to you about in a short amount of time. Um, but
yeah.
it gives that glimpse of hope. And it's like, gee, if we put the poor and the working class first over a corporation,
Right.
it's
Well,
like we're going to win elections and actually get people in that actually gives a damn, and then we can start working on some of these things. So just curious to know what your thoughts are about what went right with Zerwan's campaign. I'm just out of curiosity.
yeah, well, I think his messaging definitely resonated with the people that
Mhm.
he wanted to represent, right? He was talking about affordability in one of the least affordable cities in the world, right? And I think that message of affordability definitely resonated, but he didn't just talk about it in an ideological sense, right? He was talking about the struggles that people were facing every day. He was talking about licensing in bodegas. He was talking about fees for taxi service. He was talking about issues that people could relate to. And I do the same thing when I'm talking to our residents in Monroe County because year over year, we have seen double digit increases in the value of our housing, right? And it has created an affordability crisis that is really hurting people, right? Because people are being kicked out of their homes just so that landlords can charge more money for rent. They want to charge market rate. So if somebody is in there, even if they've been in there for 5 years, a very stable tenant, now they're looking at that, 15% year over year increase in market value. And they're like, well, if I kick this person out, then I can charge more. Right. And it's not just, it's not right, but it's following that almighty dollar. And so I think that we need to, increase the amount of housing that we have in this community because we have so many barriers to building. This is a community, a county that has a lot of restrictive zoning codes that created the suburbs here. And so we need to look at relaxing some of those zoning codes so that we can build more housing. And then we need investments from the federal level to make sure that we are building housing that is affordable, subsidizing housing that is affordable. And one of the ways we can do that is if you look at the Green New Deal for housing, is by building housing that is more sustainable, right? Energy wise, your energy costs are going to be lower because you are building in some of those sustainable energy infrastructure pieces that we need on so many levels, right? Not just because of affordability, but obviously in order to secure the future of our planet. So, I think talking about those things for people, talking about the fact that they can't afford their RG&E, that they can't afford their healthcare costs or their childcare costs, and how we are going to address those issues really is very different than what they normally hear from their representatives. And so that's how we win. And we saw it in Seattle, we saw it in New York City. Like you said, we see it even in places that we consider more red, like Georgia. Georgia, Atlanta going for a Democratic Socialist on their city council is new. But again, I think we have very populist ideas in the progressive wing, but we do a very poor job of selling them, right? So I think it's just a matter of getting out there, talking to people, and meeting them where they are.
Exactly, and that's the key thing. And I think a lot of politicians miss the mark whenever it comes to meeting people where they are. And it all comes down to the money in politics. So again, thank you for addressing that.
Mm,
Now, kind of pivoting for a second
mm,
and thinking about like mental health. Okay, so there's been a lot of cuts
mhm.
to mental health funding
Yeah,
from the federal government.
yeah.
And we still have this war on drugs that is still going on. And you talk about this on your platform, and you also talk about harm reduction.
Yeah.
For those who may not understand, do you want to give like a Cliff Notes version about the war on drugs, first of all, and why obviously this is still ongoing? Because you have pharmaceutical companies that are pushing, and spreading misinformation and, cutting
Yeah.
cutting like this funding for this. And I'm in full support of mental health crisis response teams, just like you have on your platform. The area that I live in, Kansas, has a mental health crisis response.
Mhm.
Um, and, they respond, they're social workers.
Yeah.
They go to these calls and they help navigate systems of care for people. And, like they do the crisis stabilization. And there's a lot that we can do in this. And I'm just curious to know, what are your thoughts as far as like mental health and like addiction treatments? And obviously this impacts, these budget cuts impact a lot of like rural communities too, like massively. But
Absolutely.
just thinking about this, what's your proposals? What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and this is very much near and dear to my heart because I've been very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And locally, we had a gentleman named Daniel Prude who was going through a mental health crisis. He was met by the cops and eventually he was killed. It was a 30-degree day out. Daniel Prude did not have any clothes on. He was clearly in crisis. And these police officers responded and they put a spit hood over his head and he ended up dying. So I think it's imperative that we have people responding who are able to address the situation that is in progress, right? We don't send, you know, we have to send the appropriate care to meet the crisis that is unfolding. And if police officers are being asked to do a lot more than what they're trained for, right? So why don't we have people who are trained in health crises showing up to situations that involve mental health? Um, we wouldn't send police to a fire, right? We send firefighters. So why would we send police to a mental health crisis situation? We need to send social workers. We need to send mental health experts who are going to be able to de-escalate the situation and keep everybody safe, right? We are putting our police officers in an unsafe situation when we're sending them to a mental health crisis that they are not prepared to deal with. So I think that having the right response that's going to render the type of care that is needed in that situation is imperative. And I think it's less expensive down the road, right? It's less expensive in terms of cost, and it's less expensive in terms of human casualty. And that is what we're trying to avoid, human casualties in these situations. Um, not to mention the millions of dollars in settlements that police departments distribute on an annual basis in order to address these wrongful deaths. You know, the human cost is incalculable, right? We want to make sure that we are keeping people safe. So why not set up these systems where A, we have, crisis centers, because we have been closing mental health facilities and not providing any alternative to people for decades, right? It was nice to see those terrible asylum buildings, those multi-story buildings close. But what has been created in response? Nothing. We have literally driven our mental health crises out into the streets. And part of that is because of the consolidation of hospitals and care, and we no longer treat mental health as an overall measure of health, right? We divide people up into their respective parts. It's like we're going to do mental health, and we're going to do your eye care, and we're going to do your dental care, and we're going to do, like, we don't treat people like whole people. And that's part of the problem with having the current system of insurance we have. Why not do expanded and improved Medicare for all, where we can treat the person as a whole person and make sure that their mental health is also being treated on a par with their physical health. But definitely, as we've seen this expansion in um, uh, substance use, we need to make sure that we are creating spaces where people know that they can go in and be safe, right? This is not an enforcement problem. This is a healthcare problem. And I'm grateful that now we are actually looking at substance use disorder as a mental health issue, as opposed to when we saw the crack epidemic, and we saw that as an enforcement issue. But again, we need to create the facilities to deal with that. And I think dollar for dollar, we would do so much better if we were having the right response as opposed to treating it like a law and order issue as opposed to a health issue.
Absolutely, 100%. And it kind of leads in and talks about the next thing that I wanted to talk about. I know we're kind of up on time here in just a little bit, but one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about was the therapeutic. Let me make sure I get this correct. So there's another aspect to mental health that I feel oftentimes left out of the conversation,
Mhm.
and it relates to conversion therapy of LGBTQ minors. Okay. So whenever we think about conversion therapy has been debunked by every single psychological organization. And I wanted to address this because I want to get your thoughts on this. So, are you familiar with what conversion therapy is? First of all, let me ask you that question.
Yes, I am familiar with the rogue practice. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you for being familiar with it because typically I have to explain it sometimes, and then people are like, "Oh yeah, I forgot that that exists." Yeah, because it's not talked about like literally at all, and that is something that is deeply alarming to me. But thinking about conversion therapy and what you know about it, the Youth Mental Health Protection Act would have barred, like nationally, would have essentially barred licensed medical professionals from enacting in a barbaric, pseudoscientific, discredited, and unproven quote unquote practice. And I'm passionate about this for one reason. I went through it for 2.5 years. I was not forced into it by my parents. My mom has always been my biggest ally.
Hmm.
I haven't done an episode on my story on this podcast just yet because it's not about me,
Right.
but it will be coming at some point, hopefully pretty soon, whenever I feel a little more comfortable doing it, because there's a lot of uncertainty around the future of the mental health,
Yeah.
arena essentially, and also these conversion therapy restrictions across the country. I was involved in 2019 with in 2019 and then 2021, I helped pass local restrictions on licensed medical professionals, specifically mental health professionals, from enacting in conversion therapy practices. And happy to report that Kansas City, Missouri, passed it unanimously. And there's obviously a little bit of, or a lot of conversation around this and around the certainty and how they're going to continue sticking whenever it comes to the Supreme Court. Because we saw a most recent ruling that kind of sent it back down to a lower court where a therapist in Colorado brought a case before the Supreme Court and stated that the conversion therapy statewide restriction, I don't say ban because we're not actually banning it, it's more like restricting access to it. And it comes down to it's a licensing issue. Essentially, is what I'm trying to get at here. It's a licensing issue, and these therapists are being issued these licenses, and they go against their own ethics. Like
Right.
I don't how is driving a young person to suicide because it is a scientifically proven fact, and it's backed by immense amount of data that LGBTQ youth that are forced into conversion therapy are 4 times more likely to die or attempt suicide, die by or attempt suicide. That is an alarming statistic that should alarm people that go around and say we need to protect children. Uh, this is insane to me that we're still having this conversation in 2026. And conversion therapy has been rooted in our society for so long. And then you see things like Westboro Baptist Church, which I live an hour north of Westboro Baptist Church. But as far as like protecting the LGBTQ plus community from the harms of conversion therapy, discrimination, harassment in all forms, what are your thoughts as far as the Youth Mental Health Protection Act? Would you be in support of it? Secondly, the Equality Act, which bars discrimination, harassment, workplace discrimination, etc. What are your thoughts as far as like protecting the LGBTQ plus community?
I think it is paramount that we protect the LGBTQ plus community. I think it is disgusting what we've seen in recent years in terms of the rollback of people's human rights. it's unconscionable to me. I cannot believe that in 2026 we are talking about whether LGBTQIA plus community has the same rights as the rest of us. It is mind-boggling to me, and absolutely I would support both those pieces of legislation. And it is personal to me as well. I am the mother of a trans daughter, um, and I have seen um, what this attack on the trans community by the executive branch has done to the community, the fear that it has instilled. I mean, again, I'm getting emotional because I'm viewing this through the lens of what we have experienced as a family j just in the past couple of years. And it's not right. We need to make sure that we are protecting everybody in our community. If human rights are selective, if we don't have human rights for everyone, we have human rights for no one. And I think that's kind of the mantra that I have lived by, making sure that I support human rights without exception. And that definitely extends to the LGBTQIA plus community, but every community.
First of all, thank you for being in.
Mm,
And I know this is personal for you, and thank
yeah,
you for sharing that. And we've seen these blatant attacks on the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, here in Kansas, and I've talked about it a couple times on this podcast. I'm going to continue talking about these issues numerous times. So if you haven't gotten it by now, people that are listening, you'll get it at some point.
yeah,
But we need to ban discrimination, not banning books,
yeah,
right?
right.
And banning books literally goes against the First Amendment of freedom of speech.
Yeah,
And I don't know where they get. I know my mom, I talked to my mom about, whenever you were in school, did you see porn in your school libraries? Where in the actual hell are they getting this information from? I didn't see it in my libraries, and I went through public schools. I am a product of public education. I
mhm,
think that these voucher scams are going to destroy communities. And the voucher scams doesn't do anything but protect the top one. You protect that top tier, protect that top 1%. Vouchers are not going to work in rural America. We need to invest in our future generations so they can run for office just like you, Robin.
absolutely, absolutely.
And
Dollars for public education, period.
it is insane to me that we're even having this conversation.
Yeah,
It's 2026.
right.
Um, there are far many other countries that are way more ahead of where we are. And it's insane because we are literally the richest country, but have the worst systems whenever it comes to, healthcare, whenever it comes to criminal justice, juvenile justice, whenever we still have discriminatory practices. We're a quote unquote Christian nation, even though they don't follow that. They want to have the Ten Commandments posted in classrooms, like in Texas and Louisiana and some of the other states, Tennessee, passing the Charlie Kirk Act, which is allegedly going to protect free speech, but only whenever it actually, benefits them, because that's when they actually care about it.
Yeah.
And it's just so insane to me that
Yeah, and my opponent voted for that. He voted for the Charter.
exactly.
It's
I was getting ready to talk about that.
unbelievable to me. And he said he voted for it because he doesn't agree with political violence, but there was a lot more enshrined in that legislation than just talking about being civil towards one another. This
Kind of,
was in fact elevating Charlie Kirk to the level of Martin Luther King Jr. And to
yes,
me, that is insanity. It is
yes.
insanity. It is offensive. And while I heard that my opponent apologized to the national director of the Urban League, he never apologized to his constituents. Within his district is the entirety of the city of Rochester, which is 42% person of color. And he never apologized to us for that vote.
And it's kind of like my current incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
She's literally an apex shill. She's on the Democratic side, but she's an apex shill. She literally is.
Mm-hmm.
And she broke history as being the first like openly LGBTQ Native American woman from the state of Kansas to be elected into Congress. However, it's like, oh, she's running on this like true progressive platform. And I'm like, oh, hell yeah, this is gonna be great. Again, I'm from Missouri. I'm not from Kansas. I didn't vote for her, and I won't be voting for her in this election either. I'll be
Right.
voting for the person that's running against her because I believe in Sarah Prue's platform. And she's the one that is running
Mhm. Yay.
against Sharice Davids. It's a lot like the race that you're running then.
Yeah.
She gets asked this questions of, oh, you're challenging a Democratic incumbent. We need to keep Democrats in office. Yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah, absolutely. But we also need to get the dinos out and get the true populists and the progressives in. Because you can say
Yeah.
that you're a Democrat, but it's the same thing as a Republican. You're a rhino or dino.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
I tell people like, the overwhelming likelihood is that the Democrats will take back the House of Representatives. Are we going to send back the same do-nothing Democrats that have been inept in opposing this administration's agenda, or are we going to send people who are going to fight for us, to fight to protect all of us?
Mhm. Exactly, and that's the $1 million question, right? And we shall see what
Yeah,
happens with the midterms coming up. Speaking of which, that's all I got for you for the time being. I mean, obviously, we can have many more conversations,
right.
but how can people uplift the work that you are doing and contribute to your campaign? How can they find you, and how can yeah, how can they uplift the work that you are doing?
They can find me online at robinforus.com. That's Robin, ROBINFORUS.com. And you can read more about my platform there. Obviously, you found my platform there and went through it. I'm pretty thorough in terms of laying it all out there. But you can donate there. You can figure out how you can get involved with this campaign. We are a grassroots campaign. We do not accept any APEC dollars. We do not accept any corporate PAC money. So we are truly grassroots built, and we would just love for you to join us.
Absolutely. Robin, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. This has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you out there. Okay.
Thank you. Let's do this.
Absolutely.